Title: The Prison Gang That Control New York, USA Jail Part 2. You think prison gangs are just about violence? You're wrong. In New York's jail system, especially inside Rikers Island, power doesn't always come from guards or even the official rules. It comes from something far more organized and far more invisible. Because while the system looks controlled on the surface behind the locked doors and concrete walls, certain gangs don't just survive. They govern. And in Part 2 of this investigation, we're going deeper into how these groups don't just exist inside the jail system, they control it from within. But here's the question no one wants to answer. How does a gang take control of a jail that's supposed to be run by the state? And more importantly, why hasn't anyone stopped them? It starts with structure. Not chaos. Not random violence. Structure. According to multiple reports from correctional oversight bodies and testimonies from former inmates, gangs inside New York jails operate with a level of organization that mirrors military units. There are leaders, enforcers, recruiters, messengers. Every role is assigned. Every action has purpose. And once you enter the system, you don't get to stay neutral for long. Because inside facilities like Rikers Island, neutrality is seen as weakness. And weakness is dangerous. Imagine stepping into a housing unit for the first time. You don't know anyone. You don't know the rules. But everyone is watching you. Within minutes, someone approaches. They don't threaten you. Not yet. They ask simple questions. Where you from? Who you roll with? At first it sounds casual. But it's not. Because your answers determine everything that happens next. Multiple inmate accounts suggest that gangs quickly identify new arrivals and assess them, based on background, affiliations, even neighborhood. If you already have ties, you're expected to fall in line immediately. If you don't, you'll be pressured to choose fast, because staying independent means you have no protection, no backup, no one to stand with you when things escalate. And they always escalate. But this is where it gets more complex. Because control inside these jails isn't just about physical dominance. It's about systems. Unofficial systems. Parallel systems. Systems that operate alongside the official rules, but often override them. For example, who gets access to certain areas? Who controls contraband? Who decides when tensions rise, or when violence happens? These aren't always random decisions. They're coordinated. According to documented investigations into Rikers Island, contraband, phones, drugs, weapons, doesn't just appear. It moves through channels. And those channels are often controlled by gang networks. Which means gangs don't just influence inmate behavior. They influence economics inside the jail. And where there's control of resources, there's power. Now here's where things take a darker turn. Because control isn't just about managing resources. It's about enforcing rules. They're rules. And those rules are strict. Break them, and there are consequences. Former inmates describe internal discipline systems, where violations are handled without involving staff. Miss a payment? There's a penalty. Disrespect leadership? There's a response. Refuse to follow orders? That's where things escalate fast. And the enforcement isn't random. Strategic. Designed to send a message. But here's the part most people don't see. This level of organization doesn't just affect inmates. It affects the entire environment, including the guards. Reports over the years have highlighted staffing shortages, burnout, and lack of control inside facilities like Rikers Island. And in that vacuum, other structures fill the gap. Because when official authority weakens, unofficial authority rises. There have been documented cases where entire housing units operated with minimal staff presence, leaving inmates to effectively manage themselves for extended periods. And in those moments, the real power becomes visible. Not in uniforms, but in influence. So how do gangs maintain that level of control? 3 key elements: fear, loyalty, and communication. Fear is obvious. It keeps people in line. But loyalty, that's more complicated. Because gangs don't just threaten. They provide protection, belonging, identity. For many inmates, especially younger ones entering the system, that structure can feel like survival, even if it comes at a cost. And then there's communication. This is where things become even more sophisticated. Because despite restrictions, gangs maintain communication not just within units, but across the entire jail system. And sometimes, even beyond it. Confiscated phones, coded messages, intermediaries. These methods have been repeatedly documented in investigations. Which raises a critical question. If communication is supposed to be restricted, how are these networks still operating so effectively? Some reports suggest gaps in enforcement. Others point to overwhelmed staff. And in some cases, allegations of corruption. Though not always proven, these claims continue to surface in investigations and media reports. But regardless of the cause, the effect is clear. Gangs don't just exist inside New York jails. They function as organized systems of control. And for many inmates, those systems are more immediate and more powerful than the official one. Now here's where part 2 takes a turn. Because controlling the inside is one thing. But what happens when that control starts extending beyond the jail walls? Into the streets, into ongoing operations, into real-world consequences. Because according to multiple law enforcement investigations, some gang activities don't stop when members are incarcerated. They continue. They adapt. They evolve. And that raises the most unsettling question of all. Is the jail system containing these gangs? Or unintentionally strengthening them? In Chapter 2 we're going deeper into that connection. How incarceration can sometimes expand gang influence instead of limiting it. And the hidden link between what happens inside Rikers Island and what plays out on the streets of New York. Because the truth is, the story doesn't end when the cell door closes. In many cases, that's where it really begins. The escalation chapter. The system is supposed to isolate. That's the idea behind jail. Remove individuals from the outside world, cut off communication, break the chain of influence. But inside New York's jail system, particularly within facilities like Rikers Island, multiple investigations suggest something very different is happening. Instead of shutting networks down, in some cases incarceration is reorganizing them, and sometimes even strengthening them. Because once inside something changes. The streets disappear. But the structure doesn't. It evolves. Law enforcement reports and correctional oversight findings have repeatedly pointed to a pattern. Gang members entering jail don't lose their connections. They reconnect under pressure. Rivals are forced into proximity. Allies regroup. Leadership becomes more centralized. And communication, despite restrictions, adapts. Imagine this. On the outside, gang operations are spread across neighborhoods. Fragmented. Difficult to coordinate. But inside a jail facility, key players can end up in the same place. At the same time. Under the same roof. And that changes everything. Because now, decisions that once took days, or required layers of communication, can happen face to face. Strategies can be adjusted in real time. Conflicts can escalate faster. They can be negotiated. According to documented accounts from former inmates and investigative reporting, certain high-ranking members use incarceration as an opportunity, not a setback. An opportunity to reassert control, resolve internal disputes, expand influence over younger inmates, recruit new members. All within an environment where options are limited and pressure is constant. But here's where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Jail is meant to reduce criminal activity. Yet multiple reports suggest that, in some cases, it becomes a hub for coordination. Take contraband phones. Despite strict bans, correctional systems across the U.S., including New York, have struggled with their presence. Confiscation reports over the years show hundreds, sometimes thousands of devices recovered. But for every phone found, how many remain in circulation? Because with a single device, communication barriers collapse. Messages can move instantly. Orders can be issued. Connections to the outside world stay active. Investigations have documented cases where incarcerated individuals were allegedly linked to ongoing criminal activity outside, through indirect communication channels. Not always proven in every case, but frequent enough to raise serious concern. And it's not just about communication. It's about influence. Inside facilities like Rikers Island, younger or first-time inmates often enter without affiliation. No alliances. No protection. And in that environment, pressure builds quickly. Former inmates and advocacy groups have described a pattern. New arrivals are assessed, watched, then approached. At first, it can seem like support. Offers of protection. Access to resources. Guidance on how to survive. But those offers come with expectations. And once accepted, they're difficult to walk away from. Because now, it's not just about surviving your time inside. It's about who you become after you leave. This is where the system starts feeding into itself. Because if recruitment happens inside, then release doesn't end the cycle. It extends it. Multiple criminal justice studies have explored this dynamic. How incarceration environments can contribute to deeper gang involvement rather than reducing it. Not because the system intends to, but because of the conditions created within it. overcrowding, limited supervision, high tension. All of it creates an environment where structured groups, like gangs, can offer something the system sometimes struggles to provide: order. And that order, even if unofficial, can feel more immediate than institutional control. But there's another layer, one that rarely gets discussed publicly: coordination between different facilities. Because New York's jail system isn't just one location, it's a network. Transfers happen. Inmates move between units, between facilities, sometimes without warning. And when they do, information moves with them. According to reports and internal investigations, these movements can unintentionally spread influence, carrying affiliations, carrying tensions, carrying strategies. So instead of isolating networks, the system can sometimes redistribute them. And then there's timing, court dates, release schedules, sentence overlaps, moments when individuals enter and exit the system in patterns that, according to some analysts, can align with shifts in activity outside. Now it's important to be precise. Not every case follows this pattern. Not every incarcerated individual remains connected to outside operations. But the fact that these patterns have been documented at all raises a critical issue. Because if even a fraction of these connections remain active, then the purpose of containment becomes blurred. So what does this mean for control? Inside, gangs maintain structure. Outside, networks continue to operate. And between the two, there's a flow of people, of information, of influence. And that flow is difficult to fully stop. But here's where the situation reaches its peak. Because eventually, control inside doesn't just influence the outside. It starts to create consequences that return back into the system. Retaliation cycles, escalating conflicts, new arrests tied to existing networks. Which means the system isn't just holding individuals. It's interacting with an ongoing cycle, one that feeds itself. And now the question becomes unavoidable. If incarceration can sometimes reinforce these structures, then what would it take to actually disrupt them? Because in Chapter 3, we're stepping into the response. What officials, investigators, and reform efforts have tried to do to break this cycle. What's worked, what hasn't, and why solving this problem is far more complicated than it appears. Because the truth is, control isn't just about who runs the jail. It's about whether the system itself is built to handle what's happening inside it. The Revelation chapter. If the system is being challenged from within, then the real question is simple. Why hasn't it been fixed? Because by now the pattern is clear. Inside facilities like Rikers Island, gangs don't just exist. They adapt, organize, and in some cases, exert control that rivals the system itself. Chapter 1 exposed the structure. Chapter 2 revealed the expansion. Now we get to the hardest part, the response. Over the past decade, New York's jail system has faced intense scrutiny, investigations, federal oversight, public pressure. In fact, conditions inside Rikers Island became so concerning that a major legal turning point occurred with the Nunez versus City of New York case. This case led to a federal monitor being assigned to oversee reforms, tasked with improving safety, reducing violence, and addressing systemic failures. On paper, it was a major step. Accountability, oversight, change. But reality is rarely that simple. Because reforming a system like this isn't just about policies. It's about conditions. And those conditions are deeply rooted. Start with staffing. Multiple reports have highlighted chronic shortages of correction officers, burnout, absenteeism. In some cases, entire housing units operating with minimal supervision. When staffing drops, control shifts. And as we've seen, that shift doesn't create a vacuum. It creates an opportunity. Then there's infrastructure. Rikers Island is an aging facility, long criticized for outdated design and limited capacity to manage modern correctional demands. Broken systems, blind spots, areas where supervision becomes difficult. And in environments where visibility is limited, informal systems thrive. But even when reforms are introduced, another challenge emerges. Consistency. Policies can change. Leadership can change. But culture, that takes far longer. Because inside the jail system, both staff and inmates operate within patterns that have developed over years, sometimes decades. Changing that isn't immediate. It's gradual, and often resisted. Now add another layer. Legal complexity. Efforts to increase control, like stricter lockdowns or surveillance, can raise concerns about rights, conditions, and humane treatment. So every solution comes with trade-offs. More control can mean more restrictions. More restrictions can mean more tension. and more tension can escalate the very problems the system is trying to solve. This is the paradox. To reduce gang influence, you need stronger control. But applying that control incorrectly can make the environment more volatile. And that volatility creates openings. Openings that organized groups are already structured to exploit. Now consider reform efforts aimed at reducing incarceration altogether. New York has introduced policies over time to lower jail populations, bail reform being one of the most debated examples. The goal? Reduce overcrowding, lower pressure inside facilities. And in many ways, that approach addresses one of the root issues. Because overcrowding fuels tension. Tension fuels conflict. And conflict strengthens the need for protection, which gangs provide. But even that solution isn't absolute. Because reducing population doesn't automatically dismantle existing structures. It changes the environment. But the networks can remain. So what does disruption actually look like? Experts often point to a combination of strategies: improved staffing and training, better surveillance and infrastructure, targeted intervention programs, separation of high-risk individuals, increased oversight and accountability. And in some cases, these approaches have shown progress. Violence rates fluctuate. Certain units stabilize. But the results are uneven. Because the system isn't dealing with a single problem. It's dealing with an ecosystem. One where social dynamics, institutional limitations, and external influences all intersect. And that's what makes this issue so difficult to solve. Because gangs inside jail aren't just criminal groups. They're adaptive systems. They respond to pressure. They adjust to new rules. They find gaps. And unless those gaps are consistently addressed, the cycle continues. So where does that leave us? With a reality that's far more complex than most people realize. New York's jail system isn't simply controlled or out of control. It exists in a constant state of tension between official authority and unofficial influence. Sometimes the system holds. Sometimes it struggles. But beneath it all, one fact remains. Control inside these facilities is not absolute. And until the underlying conditions are fully addressed, it may never be. So the next time someone asks what really happens inside places like Rikers Island, the answer isn't simple. It's not just about crime, or punishment, or even justice. It's about systems, visible ones, and invisible ones, working at the same time, sometimes against each other, and sometimes, one becoming stronger than the other. If you want more deep investigations like this, real stories, real systems, real truths, subscribe and stay tuned. Because this isn't just one story, there are more, and they go even deeper.